Okay, thank you very much. I too would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Bunurong people, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for coming along this morning. It's terrific to see so many people here talking about the National Disability Insurance Scheme. I've addressed many forums like this around Australia over the last few years, and one of the most exciting things, I think, is that now people, not just in the disability community, but throughout the Australian community, are talking about this insurance scheme and the need for it. And with that comes enormous power. For too long, I think people with disabilities and their families and carers have been like mendicants, coming along hoping for a scrap of this or a scrap of that. And now what we're seeing is both a recognition within the community that what's happening is unfair, that it needs to change, and that societies should be judged by how they support the most vulnerable within their community. On Monday, National Disability Services, which is the umbrella body for disability organisations, held its national conference. Both the Prime Minister and the Minister and the Leader of the Opposition addressed that conference because of the emerging power of people with disabilities, their families and carers. And we need, as we go through the months and years ahead, to remember that one of the things that's happened over the last few years is that this part of our society has become empowered, and that the rights that Leah talked about are there and need to be ensured. So this morning I would like to talk about the what, the when, the where of the NDIS, and just how we can absolutely make sure that we make it real for not just Australians today, but for all Australians in the future. So I'd like to begin with the Productivity Commission report and its major findings, then talk about who's eligible, because that's the issue I think that is of most interest to people, what the benefits will be, when and where the scheme's going to be rolled out, and then talk about the ongoing development of the scheme, because one of the things that I think is really important to recognise is that the scheme will start on the 1st of July 2013, but it will evolve. And the aspiration I think that we must all have is that in 10 years' time, when the scheme is fully rolled out and has been available to all Australians for a few years, that we have in fact a world best disability scheme to match the other parts of our social security and economic policy framework, which are also best practice. So the Productivity Commission, as Leah indicated, described the current disability system as underfunded, unfair, fragmented and inefficient. The power of that was that the Productivity Commission, which is renowned for its dry economic analysis, for its objective analysis, chose to use such colourful language to describe the current system. To have major change, you must have a burning bridge, and the burning bridge in this case is the complete failure of the current system to adequately meet the needs of people with disabilities and their families and carers. And to have this objective analysis, I think, put the need for reform, for major reform, beyond doubt. And they had two principal recommendations. The first is that the government should establish, the Commonwealth Government with the states should establish a national disability insurance scheme to cover all people with severe or profound disabilities who acquire those disabilities before the age of 65, and a national injury insurance scheme to cover anyone who was newly injured. So in Victoria, we have our own two versions of the National Injury Insurance Scheme in the Transport Accident Commission and WorkSafe. So on a no-fault basis, they provide cover to people who are injured. But people who are injured in other situations as a result of medical negligence or an assault in the street or falling off a ladder, they're not insured in the same way. And so they recommended that this scheme be, the existing injury schemes be expanded. It's also important to recognise that while we have the Transport Accident Commission in Victoria providing no-fault cover in the event of a motor vehicle accident, that doesn't apply in South Australia, Western Australia and Queensland. So they wanted to see a completion of this network of injury schemes. In many ways, you can see from the description I've given of the NIIS, what is being proposed here builds on some of the best practices around Australia. But in many ways, what the scheme actually does is it leapfrogs current reform directions. So we have plans and processes in place to create individualised funding packages. What the Productivity Commission said is there must be a principle here of control and choice so that the individual is in control of the services that they receive. So instead of service providers like Uralla being directly funded, the funding will go directly to individuals who will then be able to shop for the services that they want. And in doing so, there will be efficiencies created because a marketplace will emerge. And so one of the other principles of this scheme is the principle of efficiency. A third very important principle is one of equity. So today, the support you receive depends on how your disability arose. So if your disability arose as a result of a car accident in Victoria or that workplace accident, you're covered. But if you're born with a disability or your disability arose as a result of a progressive medical condition, you're largely reliant on family and friends until the crisis hits, and then government support will be provided, more or less. And the other principle is one of sustainability, that this scheme must be sustainable for future generations as well as the current generation, and that as part of that sustainability that there is certainty of funding. But this is about more than those principles, and it's about more than the additional funding, the doubling of funding that Leah talked about, because this is about investing in people's futures. And insurance schemes approach the way they support people very differently to the current welfare model. So in our current model of support, the focus by government is largely on how they can minimise the costs in any particular year. In contrast, an insurance scheme looks to minimise the costs of support over a person's lifetime. So if early intervention is going to provide a long-term benefit, and we know that that is clearly the case, then early intervention services become very, very important, and they are an investment in the future. Similarly, home modifications, which can lead to people being much more independent, are an investment. Well, they might cost more up front, but over time they pay a dividend. So there are important differences between the way an insurer will approach supporting people with disabilities and the way the support is provided today. Insurers also invest in research and in best practice, and they also want to make sure that they maximise people's opportunities over their lifetime. So this is about a fundamentally different scheme, a different approach to the one that's applied historically. But there will be an element here of tough love, because this scheme also fits within the government's agenda around participation in community and in work. So with those entitlements, with those rights, will also come expectations that people, where they can, will work, where they can participate in the community, they will do so. So who is eligible? The first answer is that every Australian will be eligible for this scheme, because disability is something that can happen to any of us at any time, to ourselves, to our children, to our grandchildren. So there will be this universal entitlement to support. There's then what the Productivity Commission described as Tier 2, people with mild to moderate levels of disability who need very low levels of support, who'll get access to referral services and will be supported in accessing the universal services that are available to all Australians. And then there will be a group which they described as Tier 3, the 410,000 people that Leah referred to. When people ask me, will I be eligible for the scheme, the real question they're asking is, will I be eligible for Tier 3 support, and will I get an individualised package? So let me now just turn to the definition that's being developed for eligibility, and I'll go through that quite slowly to try and give you a sense of who will be included in Tier 3. I'm sorry about the small print, but the first point is that all Australians who are resident in Australia will be eligible. The individual has to be aged less than 65 when they enter the scheme. The reason for that is that this is an insurance scheme. All of us, or at least most of us, will acquire disabilities as we age, as part of the latter stages of our lives. One can save for that, but one can't insure against it. So this is about an insurance scheme, but one which also will need to link in closely with the aged care scheme, and it's very significant that the Productivity Commission undertook a review of aged care at the same time as it made its recommendations about the NDIS, and there was a clear focus in that aged care report on how the two schemes should dovetail. The individual has a disability that is attributable to one or more of intellectual, cognitive, neurological, sensory or physical impairment, or to one or more impairments attributable to a psychiatric condition. One of the areas that people ask about very often is whether sensory disabilities are included, and the answer is yes, and similarly with mental illness or psychiatric disability. So again, that's because this scheme is based on need, and if you have a psychiatric disability and so an episodic need, you still have a permanent need, even though it might only manifest itself from time to time. The impairments need to be permanent. They need to result in a substantially reduced functional capacity to undertake or psychological functioning in undertaking one or more of the following activities: communication, social interaction, learning, mobility, self-care, self-management, and that the impairments affect the person's capacity for social and economic participation, and the person's supports needs in relation to his or her impairments, I'm sorry about the language, are likely to continue for the person's lifetime. But in essence, what we're talking about are people who've got permanent disabilities, who are aged less than 65, and there is a substantially reduced functional capacity. The second important category is one of early intervention, and in essence there are two categories within that. Those who have a progressive medical condition that manifests itself later in life, so they will be eligible for early intervention services to keep them engaged in work and community and family life for as long as is possible, and children who are born with a disability and who show significant developmental delay. For people in Tier 3, they will receive a package of support which is described as reasonable and necessary. And clearly the question that people are raising is, what is reasonable? The packages will include personal care and support, therapy, aids, equipment and home modifications, access to training, development, education, community and work, And importantly, there will be local area coordinators who will be available to assist people in Tier 3, but also assist those in Tier 2 in gaining access to community support. Reasonable and necessary is also a very complicated definition, but in essence it says it's about helping people pursue the goals, objectives and aspirations in their plan. So the critical part of this will be a planning process, will assist the participant to facilitate their social and economic participation, represents value for money, will be or are likely to be effective and beneficial. And this is all about the official language that's being used, and takes account of what is reasonable for families to provide, because today I believe that families are being asked to provide an unreasonable amount of support for far too long. And the final point is that this support is best provided through the NDIS rather than through the complementary systems of health and education and employment services. So the scheme will be launched on the 1st of July next year in 5 launch sites. Here in Victoria, it will be in the Barwon region, so if you're lucky enough to live across the water, you'll be included as one of the guinea pigs in this scheme. I think it'd be one of those occasions where it'd be pretty good to be a guinea pig. But if you're not in that part of Victoria, we're going to have to wait, and I'll come in a moment for just how long that might be. There'll be another very large launch site in New South Wales in the Hunter region, so from Newcastle up through the Maitland region and up through Cessnock, through that Hunter Valley area. The ACT will be a 3rd launch site. And in each of those sites, everyone who's eligible for the scheme will be included. In South Australia, there's going to be what's called a cohort trial. So anyone who's aged 0 to 14 will be included in the trial or in the launch site, and in Tasmania, young adults between the ages of teenagers from the ages of 15 to young adults aged 25 will be included in the launch. The draft legislation setting out the NDIS and how it's going to be regulated was tabled in the Parliament by the Prime Minister last week, and I think it was extraordinarily significant that it was the Prime Minister who tabled it, just signalling how deeply committed her government is to introducing this scheme. In her words, we will get this done. The further rollout, however, is going to depend on COAG, the Council of Australian Governments, and they're actually going to be meeting on Friday. There's a possibility, well, there's no doubt that the NDIS is going to be talked about at that COAG meeting on Friday. The hope is that before too long, the Prime Minister and the Premiers and the Chief Ministers in the territories, in the Northern Territory and the ACT, are going to agree on how this scheme is going to be fully rolled out. Because today what we have is a commitment to a lottery. Roughly 1 in 20 Australians who should be eligible for this scheme is going to get access through the launch sites. And that will be as deeply unfair as the current system. So it's important that we keep up the pressure on our governments, on both the Commonwealth and on the states, to deliver on the promise that they've made, because every government and every political party has said that this scheme needs to be introduced as quickly as possible. In the reform work that's going on, the work on the National Injury Insurance Scheme is largely stalled. There will be, I think, reform of the motor vehicle accident schemes in South Australia and Western Australia and Queensland, and that might happen relatively quickly, but the other areas, I think progress is very slow. So the way the NDIS legislation is framed is that all people, irrespective of how their disability has been caused, will be included in the NDIS. So those people who are injured in future and who are not covered by a no-fault accident scheme will be included in the NDIS, just as people in the past who've been injured have been included in the scheme. The scale of the funding challenge is there on this chart. The Commonwealth Government's committed about $1 billion in the budget back in May, but that's over 4 years, and in the next few years they'll be spending committed about $350 million to the scheme. That contrasts with the $7.5 billion that it's going to cost to fully roll out the scheme, and we need to make sure that governments give this scheme the priority it deserves. There is no doubt that this scheme is affordable. The only question is, will governments back up their talk of support with the financial wherewithal to make this scheme happen? So I think we stand at a very exciting point, a point that I think many people never expected would arise so quickly, where there is the start of the scheme, where there is $1 billion from the Commonwealth Government, where the Commonwealth Government has now introduced legislation, where the Commonwealth and the states are talking about how this scheme will be introduced. But we need to keep them honest. We need to make sure they deliver this scheme. And we also need to work, I think, with the Commonwealth and the states, with the new National Disability Insurance Agency, to make sure that this scheme absolutely meets the needs of people with disabilities, their families and carers. It's extraordinarily encouraging that the Commonwealth is engaging so openly with the disability community and the broader community. And if you want to go and become involved, go to the website www.ndis.gov.au and you too can have your say. Thank you very much.